Hello everyone, welcome to Live on Air this evening. It's with a great deal of pleasure that I've got John Evans and Uesifili Unasa with us, and we're going to talk about theology in the life of our congregations, ourselves, and where we learned it, and a whole heap of little things that build up to some very, very big, important questions about truth in the postmodern era. So I wonder, let's start with Uesifili. What interested you in theology, and what area did you study when you went to Dunedin?
I began my studies originally in Piula in Samoa, and I had done a year there of not exactly theological studies, but more agricultural work. And I thought after a year it was time for a change, and I went to Dunedin as a private student, funding myself at Knox Theological Hall. I had heard so much about Knox that I thought it might be a worthy challenge to take up something theological in Dunedin. So I did, and I wasn't quite sure what to expect when I got down there, except that I saw lots of people who were very serious about their theology and being academics. And I kind of enjoyed the community, and theology might have been more accidental than anything else. Anyway, I did enjoy Alan Torrance, who was teaching theology at the time, and I thoroughly got into that, and I did a bit of church history and tried to learn a bit of Greek, which I must admit was a great relief when I passed stage 1, so I could go on to do the rest of the Bachelor of Divinity. But that was probably because I almost memorized the whole Greek book just to get through. So yeah, I did enjoy the rigorous debate and the kind of community that was the Knox Theological Hall. And I have to say it's one of the most meaningful and enjoyable time of study that I've had over the years. So that's what drew me to Dunedin, and I've not regretted it.
Great. John?
Thank you, David, and hello to everyone. I did a PhD at University of Otago, Knox College. I had been recently ordained as a Uniting Church minister, and prior to being a minister, I had been a lawyer. I was interested in questions of church-state relations and how the church would respond, and I'm talking about late 80s, early 1990s here, how the church would respond to, post-Christendom time, particularly in this context of church-state relations. I'd been advised that Peter Matheson was a church historian that had done work on church and state relations, particularly in the German context, but I took that opportunity of making contact and starting this process of doing a history piece on church-state relations. Initially, I wanted to compare Australia and New Zealand responses, but I launched into understanding New Zealand church history, and I got so much material, I ended up just focusing on New Zealand church-state relations. I had a wonderful time. And a couple of experiences just to note was that I constantly would be asked at Knox, why have you come here? As if it was a rare thing to do as an overseas student, not that far away, an Australian, why would you come to New Zealand? Inferiority complex type question. To which I would reply, well, why not? I found it was a very rich experience because I had grown up with a particular view of what it meant to be an Australian, say an Australian Christian, outpost of Asia, small isolated country. When I got to New Zealand, I discovered that Australia was viewed as that awful Big Brother. It was big, brutish, owned all our banks, etc., etc. And that was a very salutary experience to see something of my own country through the eyes of Kiwis, as I looked at the role and the place of the church in this, well, contemporary times. So that was very good to have that New Zealand experience. As for studying in Knox, it was wonderful at that time, and I hope it still is. There were about 15, 20 full-time postgraduate students, people doing PhDs. And indeed, I can remember writing a constitution, an organisation that we called Teresa, Theological and Research Students Association, that endeavoured to organise work in progress type papers and discussions, and it was a good time to be in Dunedin. As a result of that, I became a Dunedin tragic. I'd go back to Dunedin at a drop of a hat.
Yeah, well, it might be better now that climate warming is occurring. If we wanted the one common thing that we didn't like about Dunedin, it was the predictability of grey days. Having said that, the actual theological hall was going through quite massive changes, and I think our common experience of being outside of the Presbyterian Church, John had come from Uniting Church, Uesifili had come from Methodist Church of Samoa, and I came from Methodist Church of New Zealand. So people that were outside the Presbyterian Church had a much better time, I suspect, during their studies than those who were caught in the internal conflicts that seemed to rack every kind of theological education in some ways. But the big advantage, as I saw it, was the ability of the hall, as it was then, to be able to relate to the University of Otago. And so all of us had connections into University of Otago that we wouldn't necessarily have got had we just been Presbyterian students. And I think that was a big plus.
It was one of the highlights. It was one of my highlights of being at Otago at that time, was the link with the wider university. I studied German. I wanted to do some systematic theological thinking. Of course, you needed to read it in German. I had a relationship with certain people in the law school, and would use the law library, history, and generally within the university. It was a good link, all because theology was regarded as a separate school within the university. It was a great time.
What's it been like since those heady days of studying at Knox, getting all these degrees and so on? Each of us has then gone out and served in different denominational capacities and a wide variety of institutions. For the sake of our viewers, we should say that John became, was it the principal of, I can't remember.
University College.
Wesley College in Sydney.
Wesley College, University of Sydney.
Yep. Wesley went on to become the Maclaurin chaplain at Auckland and gained a Fulbright scholarship and toured United States institutions. Stood for the mayor of Auckland. Against, I might add, my advice, but he'd never taken my advice anyway, so good on him.
I should have listened to my
What's
elders.
it been like actually taking the yeah, well, I don't know. I don't know about being elders either. But what's it like taking theology that's learned at a very high level and trying to apply it into church situations, into denominations?
Let me start there, David. I had gone into theological college from a very conservative base of Presbyterian Pacific Island Church in West Auckland. And having done a master's degree in political studies in the University of Auckland, I found that the university way of looking at things and my conservative Pacific church background and theology through which we were nurtured were actually poles apart. And one of the things at Otago and the theological education that was provided to Otago University in the theological hall there was that it really challenged and opened up my awareness of the world beyond the literal translation and the literal understanding of the Bible, which was imparted to us every day, every Sunday by our highly respectful and honourable minister, but certainly very conservative and traditional. And one of the things that I thoroughly enjoyed and I think has had an everlasting kind of an impact, an enduring basis for me, was hearing how the Bible actually is a transformative way of looking at the world. And liberation theology for me was something I had never heard about, but it connected to the political studies work and program that I had done at Auckland University. And for the first time, I could see there was a connection between my faith and the political world and the everyday world in which I was very much part of, but never quite articulated that world in a theological way. And so the liberation theology, which I learned through Otago University and the Theological Hall in Knox, really has underpinned the way I've approached my ministry and the way I see the world since.
Yeah.
My response would be at two levels. One is at a personal level, how I found my time at Otago personally enriching and how I've drawn on that period of study in my life since. And then a general observation about what's happening within my church and its interrelationship with theology generally. At a personal level, I was looking at church-state relations, and those particular issues and questions have continued to exist, continued to be at the forefront of the church's contemporary engagement with civil society. And so questions of social justice, let's say in Australia, the whole question of refugees continues to be a major theme. The ongoing funding of Christian social services by the state and what's happening has also continued to be a major issue, and I've been involved as if you like, a superintendent minister of a small parish mission in the Australian context, and that gives rise to all sorts of questions about, do you sell your soul when you receive government money, and how you can operate as the church. There are huge questions arising in Australia for the location of the church over this whole question of the institutional response, the church's response to child sex abuse. And that work that was done at a perhaps an abstract or theoretical level all those years ago as a postgraduate student, a PhD student at Otago, are very relevant today as the church is struggling to find its location within civil society, when civil society is not giving any privileged position to the church in how it operates. Once it was regarded, well, yes, you can be a world unto yourself in the life of the church, how you operate and what you do, but no longer. the church has failed its responsibility in this particular crucial area, and so the state is coming, knocking at our door, requiring us to be of a certain legal structure, to have certain policies, to operate in particular ways. And we're finding it very difficult being the church today in that particular context, let alone the fact that the wider world might have seen the church as being irrelevant. Now, the next theme is, does the church relate with deep theological thinking? And my humble assessment as a Uniting Church minister is that we are not giving it enough focus and attention. We are so anxious about our position in this post-Christendom time, and how do we survive has become the major focus, rather than really grappling with the issues that we should be grappling with to provide that guidance and help, not only for our members but for our wider society. So the question of forgiveness as it relates to institutional response to child sex abuse. Are we talking about that? The question of truth when one encounters alternative facts and fake news. Are we entering into that particular debate? There are questions that the wider community is asking and grappling with, and we're not there. That theological discourse is not there. We're more interested, I think, in just trying to survive as a denomination within our community.
That resonates with you, Uesifili. That's along the lines of some of the things that you've been saying recent times.
Yeah, I think, John, my reflection on our context in New Zealand, and particularly our Methodist context, is that the issue is not so much about trying to survive. It's actually about how to hoard as much as you can possibly hoard in terms of the church's assets. And it comes down to theology, and it comes down to our cultural identity. It comes down to how we see our place in the scheme of things and the pecking order. That is the issue for us in the Methodist Church, not so much how do we survive. The other issue is, how can we be relevant? We don't want to be relevant to anybody else. We really want to just have all the resources we possibly could grab. And actually, we will survive all right, but we will not be relevant to anybody other than ourselves. That is the issue, I think, for our particular context in the Methodist Church, whether you're Tongan or Samoan or Pākehā or Māori or Fijian or whatever. That is the biggest issue. And I think we have lost the ability to theologize because we have been so distracted by all the peripheral things that we think will give us relevance and meaning. Who knows?
Well,
could I take a contrary point of could I take a contrary point of view to the two of you? And it's a point of view that I learned at the University of Otago. It wasn't taught to me by any of the learned professors. It was in about my second year, and this young Australian high flyer, John Evans, said, "Have you read Jacques Ellul?" And I looked at him, and I said, "I've never heard of Jacques Ellul." And he said, "Well, you must read it." And I can't remember the exact title of the book anymore, but I read this. He writes in a particular style. It is a very French way of looking at the world, but it addresses directly this question of relevance. And Ellul would say, well, it's not really about being relevant to the world. It is about being relevant mostly to ourselves.
Yeah.
How do we be authentic to ourselves and allow the authentic Christian voice to come through? What we are is he may not have said radically flawed human beings, but he certainly had a highly developed concept of sin in a corporate sense. And I wonder whether part of our root problem is, in fact, that I'm no Barthian, I'm not a fan of Karl Barth at all, but I wonder whether part of the problem is that we no longer talk about these different modes of theological thinking. So we imagine that we're being relevant to ourselves, but my experience, for example, of Māori and Pacifica and Pākehā New Zealand interaction is that all the groups, when we're talking church and faith, they're all talking past one another. They don't mean the same thing. They imagine there's a relevance and a commonality, but I'm not so sure there is. And the problem, as I see it, Uesifili, correct me if I'm wrong, with the influx of Pacifica into New Zealand society in the 1950s, the early influx of the Samoan community, and then latterly particularly the Tongans, there has been a way of being church, and I suspect this would be the same for the Koreans flooding into Australia or the Filipinos. There's been a way of being church that when you try to bring that church into the church that existed, and for Kiwis, the church that existed was a Māori Pākehā, a very unequal partnership, but it was a Māori Pākehā relationship. That church is now supplanted by a whole lot of different theological and cultural values that make the old church impossible to administer, impossible to do ministry with, because those old values have been supplanted by a new set of cultural values. Well, and I'd be really interested to hear both of your opinions about that and Jacques Ellul.
I vaguely remember a conversation with you about Jacques Ellul. Jacques Ellul always sticks in my mind with the quote that Christendom wasn't all bad. And I think there's some truth in that yes, we did need, we do need, and we should appreciate the place and role of faith in public discourse that at least Christendom gave the opportunity to be engaged in. What I fear in the Uniting Church is that with the arrival of migrant ethnic folk, which has been great, and perhaps we haven't handled it as we could, but we are developing our tribes. Now that might be again okay, but certainly a self-understanding of who we are as the Uniting Church gets lost. Recognising a Korean perspective or a Filipino perspective or whatever migrant ethnic group might arrive. We welcome the arrival of these groups because they're growing, they're vibrant, and they're strong. But to foreshadow one of the discussion points that we will shortly come to is that do they engage with the prevailing culture in a way that, say, the old church, the traditional church, knew it had to engage with? If I can just quote a section from the Basis of Union, which is a foundation document for the Uniting Church, if I can quote. The Uniting Church lives within a worldwide fellowship of churches in which it will learn to sharpen its understanding of the will and purpose of God by contact with contemporary thought. Within that fellowship, the uniting church also stands in relation to contemporary societies in ways which will help it to understand its own nature and mission. So there's a statement that welcomes all these different groups, but it's got an amazing assumption, and I don't know whether it's a valid assumption, an amazing assumption that there's a meta-narrative here about our engagement with the Enlightenment project. And that is where the church finds itself. But all these different fellowships that are now part of the church, that is not a priority of engaging with the Enlightenment project. The priority is maintaining their identity as Koreans or whoever. And we're losing something of, well, what I think is most important, if you like, a theological question about how we do engage with the Enlightenment project.
Yeah, I just to add to that, John, I think the big issue for us here is not so much the engagement with these new groups, albeit they've been here 30, 40, maybe even 50 years. It's the fact that they are ultra-conservative. And we have not quite been able to grasp in our minds, let alone our theology, what does that mean? Because it is a matter of, in my view, kind of back to the future sort of thing, where most of these groups are holding tenaciously to where they have come from and what they have learned in the past, and they're not so open to negotiating whatever the middle ground is. There is no middle ground. It's a very conservative edge to our experience here in New Zealand. And so whilst we can administer that this particular group has their ministry here and they do their thing here, we actually can't find much common ground between the old and the new. And the new is more older than the old.
It sounds a bit like a political slogan that has gained currency. This political slogan is "Make America Great Again." You can substitute the word America with Methodist Church, Uniting Church, whatever, and it's seizing on that same almost subculture values rather than looking at the reality of, well, I'm calling it the Enlightenment project, the context in which much of the 20th century theology has been discussed and looked at.
Yeah, I think when we were doing a bit of a talk about this last Friday evening, you were saying the world of science is the prime example of you know what's grown out of the Enlightenment, and can you divorce yourself from all of these advances in science? Now, this is, I think, a really relevant question when it comes to our cultural mores and perceptions. And I'd be interested in both of you to comment on this, that recently the New Zealand Parliament passed some legislation that granted the status of the Wanganui River personhood on the basis that the iwi associated with that river would say, we are the river flows through our veins as much as it flows down the bed through which it flows. And so there's been political debate about whether you can declare river a person. But as some very astute politicians and lawyers have pointed out, well, we grant the same fictional status to a trust. The Romans invented trusts 2,000 years ago, and that is essentially a fictitious person. And it actually makes more sense to say, if the river is a living thing, if we grant it the status of personhood like ourselves, we're more likely to take better care of the environment around that river. And the same could be applied, I suppose, out to the world of animals and the methods in which we farm. And I mean, one of the most disgusting industries throughout the world is the way in which chickens are farmed or pigs are being farmed. And the reality is that genetically we're not much different from the pig. You could take pig valve and insert it into a human heart, which is done regularly, and it's a perfectly good fit as opposed to a mechanical valve. But at the same time that all of this, I think, is extremely positive, you then get out of that same worldview that said, let's grant the river the status of personhood, you get also the idea that, well, you shouldn't tamper with the environment. We don't want any part whatsoever of genetic modification. I guess because, at least from a Maori perspective, that might interfere with what is their understanding of whakapapa and lineage and so on. So you've got conflicting views, if you like, that are going on within society itself. And where is the church in any of this debate? Because these are the very things that it could be discussing, the spirituality of nature. But I don't hear, well, at least I don't think I've heard the voice of a church on it. Am I right?
Well,
I haven't
certainly.
Heard anything.
Pardon me.
No, we haven't had similar political development in Australia, but in recent times there has been some blowback on the anti-scientific views of some members of our parliament, One Nation, for example, over the question of vaccination. And the government has come down very strongly and said, well, look, the science is the science is the science, and it is healthy for our children to be vaccinated. And over here, you on you know, I don't know, far right, far left, whatever, you might have your beliefs about vaccination, and we will back up the scientific understanding of the importance of vaccination with restrictions on access to childcare payments, access to kindergartens and schools over your particular attitude towards vaccination. So it's there, coming from, if you like, the other side.
But the church isn't in the debate.
The church is not there. Church is not there in the debate. No.
Uesifili.
Yeah, I have found that issue, David, that you raised about the granting of the personhood to the Whanganui River. I too read it in the lofty terms that you read it, but I took it as it was a convenient legal arrangement, so that like a company or like a trust, no one can own it by granting the river ownership, because there's a sensitivity around the law or around the politics here in New Zealand that we don't want to give any ownership of water to anybody. And it seems like a very convenient way of working around the law so that no one can own it, but it's actually a independent landmark or some national asset that no one has any claim to. I do agree, though, that I think these are the sort of debates that we seem to go missing in action over when these are the very issues. I mean, we talk so much about climate change and about, creation, but we don't seem to understand how these things relate to the current debates of say in our context, David, of New Zealand. It's a profound term.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You've only got to look at Australia, and it has had its lucky image because of the mining of its natural resources. If you went to the Scandinavian countries, Norway and Finland, and you would find that they've exploited oil resources. But here in New Zealand, we have the peculiar situation where multinationals like Nestle would like to take our water and bottle it and export it and sell it for an enormous profit. And we say, oh, yes, okay, it's free. And the answer that our politicians have given, that this water somehow is only, that they want to take, is only a minuscule, minute proportion of the total amount of water that falls in southern New Zealand every year, particularly in Dunedin. No, Dunedin's pretty dry, actually.
Snow.
They say it's such a small proportion that it doesn't matter. But the real point is, the vast majority of water doesn't go through this incredible aquifer process that purifies and purifies and purifies over thousands and thousands of years. And so there are differences in water quality. And I haven't noticed, for example, that Nestle wants to take water from the Waikato River. It's only idiotic Aucklanders that want to take water from this, and they have to purify it to the nth degree before it becomes fit for drinking. No one in their right mind in the Waikato drinks water in the Waikato from the Waikato River. So my point is that in the postmodern world, we've got politicians giving little bits of the truth. And I think you've said this on a couple of occasions, John. Trump, well, you tell it in your words. It's your thesis.
Well, I think it's the revenge of the postmodernists, because Trump is against the meta-narrative of the Enlightenment project, because he has a particular view of the world. It's a very narcissistic view of the world, but he has a particular view of the world, that he can gain power and be president of the United States. But it's about what he believes. It's about his version of facts. It's about his understanding of truth. It's everything news, and so we are the postmodernist analysis of what's happening in the world is that you've got to privilege the alternative views. Well, he is privileging his own alternative view of his understanding of the world, of being a downtrodden billionaire. It's quite frightening that he can be so dismissive of science and rationality and where we have come in the last, 200-300 years. He can be so dismissive. Oh, well, I've read somewhere, I've heard somewhere this particular view. His attitude towards climate change is just frightening. Garbage. Can't believe that. Look, it's a cold day. we don't need any policies in that regard. So it's a very real phenomenon that is now happening. Not only Trump, Marine Le Pen, Brexit, One Nation in Australia. I don't know political movements in New Zealand, but people have been given a voice to be skeptical about science, rationality.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'd like to just bring our discussion to a conclusion. Uesifili, have you got any sort of closing comments on what we've been talking about?
Yeah, I was just trying to follow up with what John has been saying in the last couple of minutes around the Trump phenomena in America. It's a fascinating turn of events, I think. It's what I found interesting about Trump is not so much his politics, but the fact that he is the man of the age. You know, he's the figure of our times in the sense that what he says is momentarily rooted in the moment. And what he says is relevant now, and in an hour's time, it's not. And it's actually a reflection of the kind of world we are in. The Facebook, Twitter, kind of world, which is news is only worthwhile as long as it's interesting. And the way we now see relationships and the way we see the world and the way we see each other is very much the kind of Donald Trump culture that, you know, it might be fake news, but it's only fake news to those who hold the opposite view. It may be alternative view, but it is still a relevant view. And I have found the last 60 odd days since he's been the president, it's a fascinating change, and really the rebut of the culture as we know it. It's a very fascinating turn of events, and whether we like him or not, his approach, the way he sees the world and the way he articulates the world is significant enough for people to follow him. And that's the dangerous bit, is that people are prepared to follow him. We're in interesting times, I think. And maybe our theology should be like that.
My concluding comments are drawn from today's lectionary reading for the Common Lectionary, which is John chapter 9. If you recall the story of the blind beggar healed by rubbing paste on his eyes and going to the pool of Siloam, the Pharisees dismissed this event entirely because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. That meant he was a sinner. Sinners can't heal, therefore the event didn't happen. But in the face of that, this guy just keeps on repeating, this man just put the paste on my eyes, I went to the pool of Siloam and I can see. He just repeats it again and again and again. But that reasoning of the Pharisees highlighted in John chapter 9 is the attitude that is gaining prominence in our world today. It didn't happen. It just didn't happen because we can't believe that that person can do any good. There was a cartoon in Christian Century, a journal I received, and it went like this. That is the end of the news. Now we have Brad to present the Democratic weather forecast and Jill who will present the Republican weather forecast.
I like it.
Well done, John.
Thank you very much to both of you, and we'll draw our evening to a close, and I hope we can come back in a couple of months and debate another issue with another theologian like Jacques Ellul as the kind of background. Thank you indeed.
Great pleasure.